Now, it's 30 years ago this month since the discovery of 2 dead newborn babies in County Kerry rocked the nation. The first, a newborn baby boy, was found with stab wounds on rocks at White Strand in Carsiveen in April of 1984. But 2 weeks later, another baby boy was discovered on the farm of Joanne Hayes at Abbey-Dorney. Initially, Joanne Hayes was charged in connection with the baby found on the beach, but those charges were later dropped, and a tribunal lasting 6 months was set up to examine the handling of the case. The baby found in Carsiveen has never been identified, and his death remains a mystery. Joining me now to reflect on the Kerry Babies case is Professor of Modern Irish History at UCD, Diarmaid Ferriter. Diarmaid, good morning.
Good morning, Pat.
Now, this, by any stretch of the imagination, was an extraordinary story, but bring us back to where it all began.
Well, it began with the finding of that body of the first baby with what appeared to be multiple stab wounds, a newly born baby, a horrific find on Carsiveen Beach, along Sandy Beach. It had clearly been washed up. And infanticide, the killing of a newborn infant is not something that was particularly unusual. There certainly wouldn't have been much public discourse about it, but it was something that had a long history in Ireland. But what was particularly striking about this was what appeared to be the level of violence that had been inflicted.
Just before you go on, a long history of infanticide. Why?
There are all sorts of reasons, partly because of the stigma associated with being a single mother. So
people disguise pregnancies and then dispatch the baby?
On quite a regular basis. I mean, you can find no shortage of court cases going right back to the 19th century in the Irish courts archive in relation to this. And women were sometimes treated with a degree of leniency. And by the middle of the century, in 1949, the Infanticide Act decided that infanticide would no longer be a capital offence. It was still a serious crime, but that was a reflection, I think, not just of the what was regarded as the inappropriateness of passing a death sentence on a young, vulnerable woman who had clearly been driven to extreme measures through a mixture
and presumably
of fear.
Some understanding of postpartum depression.
Yeah, and I mean, again, they wouldn't have been using that kind of language that we'd use now, but certainly, yes, these were people who were obviously profoundly distressed, and that this had been a major factor in what they had done, and that there was a need for there to be some sort of compassion shown. But at the same time, a lot of this is underground. I mean, these are only the cases that came to court. For all those that came to court, there were many that didn't. And you mentioned there at the outset that the body of that baby, never identified. Parentage never identified. So a lot of unanswered questions.
So what led the Gardaí then to the home of Joanne Hayes?
Well, the Gardaí were obviously looking for a culprit because of the nature of this crime. And this week, 30 years ago, Joanne Hayes rang in sick to work. She was working in a local sports centre in Tralee. She lived in Abbey-Dorney, a few miles outside of Tralee. And she rang in sick to work. And 2 days later, she presented herself at a local hospital, claiming that she had miscarried, had a miscarriage at 5 months, but tests then proved that the baby had actually gone to full term. And the Gardaí felt that they had had their culprit. They started ringing around to the hospitals to see if anyone had presented themselves, and they believed that they had got their culprit. So they brought Joanne Hayes in. She was 25 years old then. She already had a child outside of marriage with her lover, Jeremiah Locke, who was a married man. And it was clear that the second pregnancy was causing problems for her. There was a great secrecy attached to this, because whatever about the first child, it was quite clear Jeremiah Locke was not going to leave his marriage, and she wanted to keep this second pregnancy a secret, and she kept it a secret even from those very close to her. And the family were then brought in for questioning. And that's where this gets very, very complicated. You can see why the guards would have believed that they had the perpetrator.
I mean, we find a dead baby that has died under violent circumstances. We find a woman who is not telling the full truth about her own pregnancy. 2 and 2 makes 4.
Yeah, so it seems to them to be open and shut at that stage. But that's when the complications arose, because Joanne Hayes went in and gave her version of what had happened at her farm. She claims that she went out in the middle of the night and gave birth to a baby boy. She was very distressed. She was in considerable pain and trauma. She went back into the house. She came back out very early the next morning to find the infant dead. And she then put it in a plastic bag, she said, and placed it in a pond on the farm at Abbey-Dorney. But what emerged then were confessions, apparently, from family members. Whilst she was giving this particular version to the guards. And the family members, according to the guards, had maintained in their confessions that the newborn infant on the farm in Abbeydorney had been violently beaten, and that family members had then taken the body of the baby and thrown it off Sleigh Head, which would explain.
So now we had an elegant story.
Yeah.
A horrible but elegant story.
Yeah.
She kills her baby. The family members take it up, throw it into the sea. It gets washed up on the beach. So now we're fine.
Yeah.
Game, set and match.
Yeah.
However,
Joanna Hayes was kept in custody, and a charge was being prepared in relation to that crime. The family members went home. They then discovered that there was indeed another body, and the body of a second baby was found in a plastic bag in a pond on the farm.
Who found it?
The family members found it. The guards had searched for this after Joanne Hayes' story, and they had not found it, or claimed they had not found it. It was family members who found it and then contacted the guards. Now, the question, of course, is what is going on here in relation to the two bodies and Joanne Hayes' involvement?
So here we have a story which is told by Joanne Hayes, which turns out to be absolutely true, and we have alleged testimony from family members which is absolutely false.
Now, tests proved conclusively that Joanne Hayes and Jeremiah Locke were not the parents of the Cahersiveen baby. That's a crucial point. So then...
But not initially, because we had this speculation that she had been impregnated by two different men.
The idea was that Joanne Hayes, as a woman of loose morals, to use the language of the time and the language that was subsequently used in the investigation, was capable of anything, to use another phrase that was used at the time. And the idea was that she had had sexual intercourse with two different men within 24 hours, and had been impregnated by both of those men, resulting in the birth of twins, and that this explained the two bodies.
Is that medically possible?
There apparently were 20 such cases in the world up to that point, but at the subsequent tribunal it was dismissed.
It does work, we know, in the animal kingdom, in the feline situation where cats can have litters made up of different fathers, but that is where they have multiple births in any event.
Yeah.
So this was the proposition.
This is the proposition, and those tests, as I mentioned, proved that Joanne Hayes was not the mother of the Cahersiveen baby. And then the charges against her were dropped in October 1984. So there was nothing to charge her with, because there was no evidence that the baby that she had given birth to had had an independent life outside of the womb.
And there was no sign of violence on the body of that little child.
So there was no evidence to charge her with anything. But the question still remained, why had those confessions been made to the guards by the family members?
And is this why we had to have a tribunal?
There had to be a tribunal because Joanne Hayes and her family made it clear to the media, and the media play a very important role in this story, that there had been, in their view, ill treatment of the family, that these confessions had been coerced, that there had been intimidation, that Joanna Hayes had been treated appallingly, that all sorts of threats had been made against her and her family, and they begin to become vocal about how they have been treated. And there's huge public interest in this for obvious reasons. The idea of an internal Garda inquiry is mooted, but neither side are going to trust that option. And Michael Noonan, who's Minister for Justice at the time, then gives in to the demands for a more extensive inquiry into this, which results in the beginnings of the Kerry Babies Tribunal.
Now, tell me about the Hayes family themselves, because you can imagine, for example, this morning we're talking about Frank Flannery being called to the PAC, well able to stick up for himself, well able to defend himself. If he does end up talking to the PAC at some stage, he will make he'll give a good account of himself, whether we like what we hear or not. What were the family of Joanne Hayes like? That first of all, they found themselves implicated in false evidence, and then that they are now forced to come into an inquiry. I mean, were they people of education, of experience in the world?
They found themselves at the centre of a media storm, and they certainly were not prepared for that. Yet they were also people who had considerable social standing. These were people who were very well integrated into the community. They were involved in sport. They were involved in politics. They were people who could stand up for themselves. And the very fact that they went to the media and made it clear that they felt they had a terrible grievance against the guards was an indication that there was going to be something of a reaction to what had happened. So they do have that. The difficulty, of course, is the way in which the tribunal progresses. Joanna Hayes is not on trial. The family are not on trial during this case. This is supposed to be an investigation into the Garda handling of this case, not a trial of the family.
But what happened?
What happened is that it became an extraordinary trial for Joanna Hayes and her family, and that generated an awful lot of backlash and public sympathy for the so-called fallen woman, which is why it's coming at a particularly interesting point in relation to the public perception of the woman and the family at the centre of the case. And there's an extraordinary degree of hypocrisy. And I'm just going to read you a very short extract from a marvellous book that was written by Nell McCafferty just after the tribunal. And she was underlining the public perception of Joanne Hayes being seen to be on trial, even though she wasn't, was one thing, but there was also the reality of what was going on behind the scenes and the extent to which this was a David and Goliath situation. This is the short paragraph. In the opening days of the Kerry Babies Tribunal, a married man went to bed in a Tralee hotel with a woman who was not his wife. He was one of the 43 male officials, judge, 15 lawyers, 3 police superintendents and 24 policemen engaged in a public probe of the private life of Joanne Hayes. When this particular married man was privately confronted with his own behaviour, he at first denied it, then he crumpled into tears and asked not to be exposed. He had so much to lose, he said, my wife, my job, my reputation. He was assured of discretion. No such discretion was assured to Joanne Hayes, as a succession of professional men, including this married man, came forward to strip her character.
So a guy was offside, and he then went on to testify in a way that would just help to destroy Joanne Hayes' character.
And if you look at the questions that they were asking her, how much had she bled before, during and after the birth? What was her sexual history? What had she used historically in relation to contraception? All of these questions, again, about the idea of a woman of loose morals, a fallen woman who was capable of anything. She got sick during the proceedings. She had to be sedated at one stage. It was harrowing. And these were some of the private hypocrisies and public hypocrisies that were on display then. But there's also the interesting public sympathy that's there for her. And people who are old enough will remember images of Joanne Hayes emerging from the tribunal with big bouquets of flowers, and feminists adopted this cause and protested very loudly and vigorously outside of the tribunal. And the presiding judge, Justice Kevin Lynch, was very critical of these protesters. At one stage he refers to the feminists protesting outside as raucous, ignorant urban dwellers. And the idea that, you know, this was generating a focus on tensions between an older Ireland and a newer Ireland, a rural Ireland and urban Ireland.
You presumably are critical of the way the judge handled the thing, because it seems, from your account of it, and I have some memories of it, that it lost focus. The job it was set up to do is to look at the guards and how you can get confessions, if you like, of disposal of a body, which never happened.
I'd be highly critical of the way it was handled. Again, going back to the idea that this was supposed to be an inquiry into how the Gardaí had handled it, that certainly wasn't the impression that was being created. Now, when the tribunal report, remember, it lasted for 82 days, was eventually published, and according to Joanne Hayes, it was published with the same insensitivity to the family as had been the case with their original treatment. It concluded that members of the Hayes family had perjured themselves. It concluded that Joanne Hayes was not guilty of any crime and that she was not the mother of the Cahir baby, but it completely exonerated the guards from any kind of wrongdoing.
So here we have, this is the finding of a tribunal, that these people went in and made up a story that fitted in with the Garda theory of the death of a baby found on the stranded Cahir. For what purpose?
Because they needed a scapegoat. They newould a culprit.
No, but I mean, I'm just saying, why would the family do it?
Oh, why would the family do it?
Yeah.
That question was never answered. I mean, if you look at the testimony...
Why would why would collude with a Garda theory to damn one of their own family members? I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
Well, it makes sense if you consider their contentions that they were intimidated, that they were terrified, that they were being told that Joanne Hayes' daughter, who was living with the family, would be given up for adoption. She was told herself that her brother could be charged with murder. There were all sorts, it seemed, according to their testimony, of threats, of intimidations. They were obviously very fearful.
When they were accused...
And remember who they were being interrogated by, Pat. They were being interrogated by the murder squad of the Garda Síochána. And this was a unit that had been set up to deal with some of the difficulties of the 70s and 80s in relation to the Troubles and some of high-profile murders. So they were dealing with very tough and seasoned interrogators who were determined to get what they wanted.
But just bring me back to the finding that the family members were guilty of perjury. And this, I presume, is that the judge decided he didn't believe what they told the tribunal.
And he didn't believe what they told the tribunal, and he said he didn't believe them because they had a history of deceit. And he cited the example of Joanne Hayes' own pregnancy and the fact that there was a secrecy around that and a cover-up, that family members had colluded, so they clearly were not reliable or trustworthy. That seems to be the inference there.
How does this fit into the times that were lived and even how it resonates down to this day?
Well, we talked a couple of months ago about the case of Anne Lovett, the 15-year-old who gave birth under a statue of the Blessed Virgin in a grotto in Granard. This is coming hot on the heels of that. It's also coming after the 1983 abortion referendum, the so-called moral civil wars of the 1980s. This is the middle of that decade. There's an awful lot of scandals that are exposed about women and their sexuality and reproduction and babies and wombs and talks of a pro-life Ireland. Here's the private reality. That these were not abstract things. They're coming into the public domain. Journalists are going after them with a renewed vigour. There's a new discourse about them. And, this idea that it was a milestone or a watershed is not a retrospective assessment. Jean Kerrigan, for example, the well-known journalist, was working as an investigative journalist at the time. And he said while the tribunal was sitting, there's a feeling that this case represents a watershed. Because for all of the denials about the reality of Irish sexuality, here they are on public display. And even when the guards initially descend on Carthus Iveen, they begin what amounts to a sexual profiling of the town, and they're uncovering all sorts of the hidden realities that people are aware of, but they're not necessarily discussing. So it's a shattering of the illusions of the island of saints and scholars and Catholic and sexual purity. There's also a vigorous debate going on within the feminist movement and about contraception. These are all very much part of the discourse of the 1980s. So again, it raised questions about that. And again, the idea of a fallen woman. What did that mean by the middle of the 1980s? It was quite clear where the public sympathy lay during that case, which represented a transition or a change from historic attitudes.
So no consequences for the Gardaí, no consequences for anybody, except the public humiliation, I suppose, of Joanne Hayes.
Yeah, the humiliation, but that in itself, leads to very interesting questions and assessments about the way in which certain institutions of the state did their business. And you can see how long a history is attached to those questions about the way certain institutions do their business and certain individuals. The idea of a closing of ranks in order to try and scapegoat somebody. The idea of an abuse of the power of the state. That there are victims and that those victims need to be recognised, and that the power relations, the networks that are at work, and the gendered nature of this. I mean, look at the lack of balance and the way Nell McCafferty described, the setup.
The men in suits.
And I mean, there were very vocal condemnations from the Women Affairs Committee of the Dáil. And again, the fact that there was a Women Affairs Committee of the Dáil, that was a recent development. So there are changing attitudes. There are changing attitudes to love, sex and marriage. In 1987, the concept of illegitimacy is abolished, the legal concept of illegitimacy. So things are changing. But there's also a sense from a sociological perspective that this is underlining two different types of Ireland. And that even Joanne Hayes herself actually represented two of those different strands of Ireland. She was somebody who was associated with a degree of openness about being a single mother, about carrying Jeremiah Locke's child in her job in urban Tralee, and then she goes back to rural Abbeydorney, which is a very different kind of life than the one she was living in Tralee. The idea that she herself encapsulates that sense of an Ireland in transition and of the different impulses and pressures that are at work. And she wasn't your typical single mother or typical fallen woman. She was somebody who
was 25, as you say.
Yeah, but she was also seen as doubly transgressive because she didn't try and hide the first child, So there's a lot that's going on there that would suggest that a tide had been turned. But the victim is still the truth, alongside those, who were so profoundly affected by it, the people involved. The truth actually never came out. And what was supposed to be about getting to the bottom of the way in which the investigation was handled It didn't do that.
It was a whitewash.
It was a whitewash. There's no doubt about that. Now, of course, those who were involved, and of course some of them are still around, would maintain that the reason why the truth never came out was because those at the centre of it initially didn't allow the truth to come out. So there's still a contested legacy to the Kerry Babies case. But what people will remember about the Kerry Babies case now is that idea of the completely inappropriate public humiliation of a young woman who had already, for obvious reasons, experienced incredible trauma. And you've got to go back to that image of Joanne Hayes outside the family farm giving birth in such distressed circumstances, and the psychological and physical consequences of that. And it did raise a question about what is a pro-life Ireland in the middle of the 1980s. The power of personal testimony, the personal stories, are beginning to bring all of these abstract legal and theological arguments about these issues. You know, they're beginning to bring them back down to ground. You're dealing with real people here who are experiencing trauma, and sometimes worse, as was the case with Anne Love.
Well, it's a fascinating story and a salutary tale, it has to be said. Diarmaid Ferriter, Professor of Modern Irish History at UCD, thank you very much.